Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. This episode of Lateral Think is also sponsored by Melbourne Athletic Development. We do this podcast to have interesting conversations with interesting people. Our sole purpose for doing this is to get better outcomes for the clients that we work with. So if you have questions or need help with your performance or injury management, contact the team at Melbourne Athletic Development. Jack.
How are you, John?
Very good, mate. What's going on?
Oh, not too much. I know you've just been away in Adelaide.
Yep.
See some good results?
No, not really.
A coach's job is never done, hey?
I think a human's job is never done. I think that's probably the reality of it, isn't it?
Well, look, I agree with your sentiment, but I don't know if a lot of people actually follow that same philosophy.
Well, that's kind of what we wanted to talk about today, wasn't it?
Indeed, yeah. I think...
just for our listeners, there is some noise going on outside, so if the sound isn't great, we apologise. It's not really under our control, but we still wanted to produce another episode of the podcast for you.
Indeed. Yeah, no, this is a topic that I've been interested in. It's something that became really very apparent to me since working with you, because we're both physiotherapists, but you're also a coach. And the thing that's always been very evident to me, and it's even become more and more evident as we've done this podcast and spoken to more coaches and seeing how they view what they do, and even the conversations that you have with them being a coach yourself, of coming at your job from a very different perspective, or using a different set of skills. And I think that's actually useful to consider of what can health professionals learn from coaches, and then also flipping that, what can coaches learn from health professionals?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's funny because I was thinking about this as, you put forward the idea of doing this podcast, and I thought about the fact that I don't think that they actually should be that different. But I think in reality they do think quite differently.
Yeah, why do you think that's the case?
I think, honestly, it's because most health professionals don't take that much responsibility for the outcomes that they get, whereas coaches are taught to take responsibility for the outcomes they get. And obviously there are legal ramifications if you really get it wrong when it comes to the healthcare side of things that may not be the same with coaching. And in Australia, particularly, we're not as litigious when it comes to, say, suits in relation to medical malpractice and things like that. They do happen, obviously, but it's not the same as someone doesn't get the outcome they want and then they sue you.
Yeah.
Which hopefully we never get to that, because I actually think that would really undermine the capability of that health professional to be able to operate in an effective manner. But I think mostly because actually coaches, most of the time they're doing it by choice. It is a passion. It's something that they love. It's something that they've probably tried to develop a lot of skills in. And whilst it is a profession, for people at the higher level, I don't know that all of them see it that way. I think they are, enjoying the ride as it happens. And one of the considerations with that is that because they love it so much, they're very emotionally invested in it. And that means that they want to get good outcomes. I'm not going to say at any cost, but at almost any cost.
It's interesting you say that though too, because I imagine a lot of people would see that as a limitation if you're too emotional about the outcome that you get with someone, because that can influence bias.
It's a double-edged sword.
Bias.
You asked before what you can learn from health professionals. Well, you can learn to be objective. I think as a coach, and it's something that I've been very open with, and I think some of the crew that we work with, obviously here at MAD, some of the physios probably don't understand why I don't actually always treat a lot of my patients, particularly if it's something that I actually think they're injured. I won't assess them.
Yeah.
Because I'm too close emotionally to be objective about it. So as you know, like you probably have picked up, like I actually ask yourself or Lydia or Dom to actually look at the injury, because I know that I can't be as objective as I want to be, and there's too much bias associated with that.
The big difference I noticed, and this is just something that I started having to question myself, is the way that a lot of all health professionals are taught is to think about what we see on average, and I think that's reflective of how research is done. In contrast, when I speak to you or when we've spoken to other coaches on this podcast, I think that really stands out.
It's an N of one.
The individual, totally. And the reality is of achieving the same result or getting someone to improve actually vastly changes from one person to the other, which brings up a couple of questions there of are there issues of thinking too much on average, and why is it that we actually see such variation in how we actually work with someone to get the best outcome for them?
Yeah, I think, and that depends on like what level you're working at. You know, like if you're coaching at, say, junior level, and most of the people are, you know, we've spoken about before, that idea of like the, you know, immature in regards to stress tolerance, they need more generic application of interventions. You know, like if you get someone who is, and this is a population that we can kind of talk to, which is pretty straightforward. You take any sort of growing teenager who might be in their peak height velocity period, they're all going to need flexibility training, right? Because the development of a lot of the aches and pains that they get is usually due to the fact that the actual tissue growth is not keeping up with different, like there's sort of asynchronous and asymmetrical kind of changes in their tissue structure. So the tissue quality changes, they get tonal changes. You know, we've spoken about the fascial network and what kind of pain presentations a lot of them get. And if you apply flexibility as an on average intervention, you're probably going to have a good outcome. Whereas when someone's system's a bit more mature and you're working at that pointier end, you need to be a much more individualized, because the stress that you apply to them, unless it's specific enough, is probably not going to make any change.
Yeah, it's actually interesting you raise that point, because it makes me think of an article I recently did a presentation for the group of looking at, when we look at a study, I realize the purpose of the population group you have is to be homogenous. But, you know, I think of the study I recently looked at and discussed of looking at upper limb versus lower limb tendinopathy. I don't know if you got to watch that presentation yet, where you've probably heard before that a lot of the tendon researchers will talk about and try to think, well, why is it that people with upper limb tendinopathies like rotator cuff or lateral elbow pain have much more diffuse broad pain and are much more likely to get central sensitization versus individuals with lower limb tendinopathy, specifically Achilles and patella tendon. And there's an article is really just more of a commentary published by, the lead author was McAuliffe, but I know Peter Malliaros was one of the other co-authors, highlighting that if you consider the population groups, they're vastly different, because most of the research looking at upper limb tendinopathies are the general population, who typically are older, overweight or obese, sedentary, high levels of fatigue, poor sleep patterns, versus lower limb tendinopathy, where it's usually much more of an athletic population. And it's like these other comorbidities are the things that increase the likelihood of people developing central sensitization. So I actually think it's a useful example for this conversation too, because I think we need to be a bit more critical when we think about applying research of what are the characteristics of the people that are in that study itself. Because the reality is we can't just make assumptions of, well, this study says this, or this, you know, researcher or guru says that this is what we're meant to do. I
think that's the critical thought that you have to have when you're evaluating that research.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, we spoke last week, I think, we spoke with Dean Benton about some of this kind of stuff. You know, the fact that you need to be able to ascertain what's going on in some of that research in order to apply it to a more specific population.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to see that particularly in high performance, whether you're a coach or a strength and conditioning coach, or even a physiotherapist or someone working in the sports medicine team, there's much more consideration for the individual variation that you see, because, well, one, you get to work with these people long term and have a lot of input, and as a result, you get to see the variation in the outcomes that occur from different interventions that you use. And I think that's one of the issues that you run into as a health professional, is we talk too much in generalizations, or sometimes even being too theoretical, without considering how those actual results from, say, research apply to the real world.
I think that's why people like case studies so much, and it's why they want to be told, like, tell me what to do.
Yes.
Because they probably have some of the principles, but they don't actually know how to apply them, because we're not necessarily taught to deal with that individual case on that more theoretical, broad learning part of what we get taught.
I think the other thing too is you're not challenged to think differently or understand complexity until you see it clinically, because it's all well and good to have it in your head of someone's got this hamstring strain or someone's got a hamstring strain, this is how I'm going to treat it, to then not get the outcome that you want and go, well, what happened there? Why did it actually not achieve what I wanted to? Where I guess that's probably one of the potential luxuries, but also imagine frustrations as a coach, is you're always dealing with not getting the outcomes you necessarily want and understanding how to change that over time.
Yeah, and I think there's just a number of factors. As I said, whether it's emotional or just competitiveness or the whole environment is, it's usually emotionally charged, even if it's just because of time constraints. You're always working towards this event or, something specific that the person's trying to achieve, whether it be a time, whether it be, a specific game that the team wants to win or whatever it is. So it really changes that concept that, one, the job is done, and two, that you can't do better, because it's always that concept of we can always get a better result. And everyone knows there's no such thing as perfect performance, but your job is to try and get the most optimal performance at all times. And I think in a general populace, for instance, when you're dealing in a healthcare setting, people are so far from the requirements of their optimal, even for the day-to-day things that they do, that you don't need to be anywhere near as specific with what you apply.
Well, and that brings me to my next question, and for you, having experience in both realms, how have your coaching experiences influenced what you do clinically?
I think it just it increases a lot of the urgency that you have with things actually, interventions being put in place. I think it means that you think about things a lot more broadly. And I think it's a general idea of what we kind of work towards in terms of our concepts, with making sure that we're addressing all the things that we think are drivers for a problem. We speak a lot about things like sleep and nutrition as being, influences on the development of injury or pain presentations. And I think it's one of those things that you have to think about as a coach quite consistently. It's like if your players are fatiguing at 3/4 time and they're cramping and they're having all these issues, it's like, well, is that something that we need to address from a nutritional standpoint? Is it a fatigue factor? Is it both? How do we ascertain that? We've got to go through some sort of process. And it makes you think very much about all of the contributors. So I think as a practitioner, I've always had that in my mind. The people that haven't been to practitioners that have worked in the space like we do, I think they're always a little bit surprised. I've had comments before. It's like, oh, you actually addressed a lot of things that I hadn't even thought of. And that's not to pump ourselves up. It's just because, as I said, I think the influence has been, well, if you're only sleeping 4 hours a night because you've got uni exams and then you go and strain your calf at, footy training, that to us is not surprising, right? And you may then go and say, for instance, test someone's calf strength or their elasticity in their calf and do all the objective testing, and you go, actually, their uninjured side, they've never had a previous calf injury, they've never had an ankle problem, so their right calf should be exactly like their left calf in relative terms. You test their uninjured side and it actually passes all the tests really well. So in your mind straight away you're thinking, well, I don't think it was a tissue capacity problem that actually led to this calf popping in the first place.
Yeah.
It's either going to be some sort of fatigue factor or under recovery or misloading kind of strategy that's happened with their training or competition. So you've got to start thinking like that. And I think that's heavily influenced the way that we think in our practice. Because as a coach, you just can't, if someone's underperforming or a team's underperforming, you cannot afford to not lift every rock up and have a look at what's underneath it. Otherwise, you'll end up getting found out. You can't just think, well, it's only the training or it's only this aspect of the training. You have to look at every aspect. And it teaches you to be, I think I've said this a million times, but it teaches you to be really humble. And it teaches you, you asked before about emotions. I think it teaches you to get better with your emotional control.
Yeah.
And learn to be more objective in that space as well. But I think it's that in itself is a double-edged sword. Is the moment that you lose that enjoyment, and because the emotional side is yes, you have the downs, but you also have the ups. So if you're stopping yourself from feeling the downs because you don't like them when you don't get the results that you want or the team wants or the individual wants, you also probably then end up limiting how much enjoyment you get when the result does happen.
Yeah, sure. But the other thing I think of too is, I think for everyone, whether you can acknowledge it or not, is we actually learn more from our mistakes anyway, because that's the bigger catalyst for realizing that something needs to change.
Well, you asked me about Adelaide, and the competition was last night, flew back in this morning, and I had a really interesting morning because, I woke up and I was still a little bit annoyed about some of the performances, and I thought, okay, there's a lot. Then, I go to the airport, I grab a coffee, I sit there, start writing in my notebook, some reflections. And then by the time I'd kind of had my coffee and sort of woken up a bit, I was like, actually, it was really, really good that we had this, because it's going to be a catalyst for more change, more improvement. Yeah. It's a growth kind of mindset that you have to be in. And I think that that's one of the things, I think we're very privileged, and I'm very grateful for the environment that we have here, where people are wanting to learn consistently, and they are curious, and they are trying to work out problems. And I've got this patient and I really can't work out why they keep having this issue, or they're getting this, we want to actually solve that. Yeah. And that comes from that growth, mindset, that idea that, I always want to know a bit more, and I'm willing to challenge myself to go outside of that comfort space. But the funny thing is, I don't think that this was, I think it's sometimes a bit of an innate trait. Because I actually remember early on in my physio career, this was well before I was coaching, getting really, really down on myself for making mistakes with patients. Like going home and being really dirty and just being like, fuck, I fucked that up, right?
Do you get that now though still?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm about to say, I definitely have that
No,
experience.
it's gotten better, in the sense of, as I said, I'm better with my emotional control with that.
You might not be as reactive, but you still have those
and you hope
emotions.
that you make less mistakes, because you've gained some experience, rather than just, just doing the same thing over and over and not learning from it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember so many times just being like, oh, fuck, how did I miss that? Or that was a mistake. And, as I said, thankfully it happens more rarely now, but that's definitely something that I remember, and that predates coaching. And I think that a lot of health practitioners have that, because the main reason that I think a lot of health practitioners get into healthcare is that they're generally compassionate to helping people, right? And that may not necessarily be on a sympathetic kind of level, from a general, conversational level. It's probably one of the things that people say to me is I'm not particularly compassionate, but I actually don't believe that, in the sense of the amount of time that I invest in people, to me, I think is a representation that I do care about people. It's just, I'm not the person to pat them on the back all the time, or feel sorry for them when something necessarily goes wrong in the moment. I think people confuse compassion and emotional comforting as being the same thing, and I don't think they are.
No, and it comes back to the point that the reality is any change that occurs usually starts with negative emotions.
What's that? It's a hormetic response, isn't it? If you're going to get change, and you're going to get, an impetus to have some improvement, whether it's learning a new skill, whether it's for us, learning from a mistake that we've made in a healthcare setting, you've got to go through that negative emotion of oh, I stuffed that up, or this is not going how I wanted, or this patient's not improving, or their pain's increasing.
And I often think of that too, when you have some self-proclaimed guru or expert who you might talk to them about, look, I've tried this particular intervention that you recommend for treating this particular problem, but I actually didn't get the outcome I wanted. And they go, well, you must have done something wrong, or your diagnosis is off, or something like that. And you're like, maybe there's other pieces of the puzzle that you're not considering. Because I always often think of that, of the people who are not willing to stop and go that's actually interesting. I wonder why you didn't get the outcome you expected, or why that didn't work, because you start to realize, and I guess it's a never-ending process of there's always potentially different layers to it. And it goes back to the point you made before of thinking about the population group, where if you're working with adolescents with, say, a low training history, the reality is you can do so many things and probably have some positive effect. And I think about that.
That happens a lot. You see it in coaching a lot, actually, in the sense of people have only coached at, say, high school level.
Yep. And
they get amazing results, often sometimes by flogging the kids.
Yeah.
And then they think that they know how to coach, and they go to coach, they might have one athlete that pops out, like I'll use my example from track, but they have one athlete that pops out of the box and they've got some talent and they go really well. Maybe they make it to world junior level or whatever. And then they keep training them in that way and the athlete just capitulates, right? And the reason is because you didn't understand that as a very receptive environment that an adolescent can be in regards to training, you know, hormonally they're very well set up to accept lots of training load and all sorts of different things. Yeah. You got a result by throwing all the eggs at the wall. But unfortunately, once, you know, especially for, say, teenage boys, like once the testosterone level goes from being 3 times the amount to a, you know, a normal level, you end up in a position where, oh, wait, actually they're not recovering between sessions. Oh, wait, actually the performance is not improving. I need to get a lot more nuanced on that.
Yeah, and look, I think you can apply the exact same principle if you're a health professional working with the general population, because if you've got someone who fits that general population characteristics, you could get them doing Pilates or resistance training or a walking program or change their work ergonomics, and they'll probably get better to some extent. But then it comes back to, have you actually maximized the stimulus or interventions you need to optimize their health? And more importantly, have you actually prioritized what are going to be the biggest modulators for them to see change? Because the reality is you can throw a lot of different things at them and see some positive effect, at least in the short term, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're giving them the best outcome.
And I think the other big thing that, like, it's hard because it means that you have to, again, emotionally take on some of this stuff. But you know, I did a talk yesterday actually as part of the meet. Beforehand, I got asked to do a talk and to other coaches. And some people, I think, sometimes are maybe a bit critical of me because I tend to be willing to take the responsibility for lots of aspects of performance, you know, including like helping my athletes navigate some life issues and all that kind of stuff. I think that's one of the things that it's probably taught me is to, you know, be willing to take on responsibility for the outcome, even though you don't necessarily have control of all of it. And that's okay. Like, you actually have to get comfortable with saying, I can't control that part.
Is that about taking on responsibility though? Is that a reflection of you understanding that performance is not just reflective of what you do on the track and understanding that these other elements?
That is, but I'm saying like the actual fact that, for instance, if some of my athletes don't perform well, I'm willing to take on a lot of the responsibility for it. And like, I tend to live by this, even though I actually know it's not true. But if they have success, it's all credit to them. If they have failure, then it's my fault. Right? And I know that that's not how it works.
Yeah.
Right? And, you know, you and I have conversations privately where, you know, well, I'm like, oh, they fucked this up and this happened and blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, I still go home and I still think about, okay, well, how can I affect that? Even if it's something that they're doing that they need to take responsibility for. I was going to say, assuming how do I create an environment where they can learn themselves to be able to navigate that? It's still my job to help them navigate that, even though I physically can't do it. So say, for instance, a perfect example is, say if someone's getting really nervous before a race. I can't run the race for them. And sometimes no matter what I say to them, it doesn't necessarily change how they think about that execution of their performance. But I can put them in touch with people who maybe can help them with that. I can expose them to learnings that maybe I've picked up from different regions of reading, or, you know, certain types of media that they can consume, different experiences that they can go through, communicating with them in different ways. There's lots of different things that I'm trying to do constantly that I take responsibility for, that even though I can't act on the performance itself.
So it's more about, like, they still need to take responsibility for their performance, but you take responsibility for the preparation, so to speak.
Yeah. You know, and like there's lots of that stuff where it's like, well, they're underperforming and we know that it's not a physical thing, right? You can easily say, oh, well, they're just, you know, mentally they don't have it, right? And that might be the truth. Some people may actually never psychologically be in the state that they need to be in to be able to perform at their best. You know, you look at people, and an example I would give, you know, because the Australian Opens was only on last month, is someone like Nick Kyrgios, right? The major reason that guy's failing is because his mindset is terrible. Right? And there's probably lots of contributors to mindset. Some of them are underlying biological things. Some are probably psychological factors. Some are probably behavioral things. upbringing, all those things, right? But if you're his coach, which the worst part is he refuses to have a coach, which tells you a lot. Your job is not to, physically tell him, do this, do that, blah, 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 which is what I used to think, right? And it's the same as a health practitioner. It's like that whole thing of like, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But your job is to make it thirsty so it wants to drink, and that's how you have to kind of think of it with coaching, which I think is the same thing. It's one of the things that I think that we've started to learn more with healthcare. And we've been exploring this a lot more ourselves of like, how do you actually create motivation for people who maybe don't have motivation if it's directed from you? And the way that you do that is you actually start to ask them more questions and start to ascertain, well, what do they want out of this experience?
What are their expectations?
And I think the same thing happens with coaching. I think, I don't know if you can call it, like that, almost like a motivational interviewing sort of style.
Yeah, it's funny you say that actually.
Same,
I've been listening to a audiobook recently, and they talk a lot about motivational interviewing and actually understanding what that is. Because I think a lot of people assume that motivational interviewing is it's your job to motivate the person you're working with. It's actually not that at all.
Yeah, and not that it's exactly this, but it's essentially like you're trying to tease out what someone's expectation is and what they want to achieve. And it's that whole thing, as I said, of like, if you can show them that they're actually thirsty, they'll start drinking.
Totally.
So, it's one of the things that coaching, I think, has slowly taught me of, rather than saying things directly, you often have to approach it by asking questions.
The right questions.
You know the answers to the questions.
Yeah.
And you know how it's going to pan out, and you know that they'll lead themselves there, but your job is to actually create that environment of communication to get them there. Yeah,
and look, by extension of that, and again, I think this is something that applies to both coaches and health professionals, is you ask questions genuinely interested in what they're saying to actually help spark them, to make them question themselves. It's actually not about asking them questions to influence, I want you to come to this outcome. Because the reality is they may not be interested in that outcome. Then you might be saying you need to create lifestyle changes to get a better outcome for your back pain long term. But there will be some people who are like, you know what, that's just not something I want to do.
And that's okay.
Totally.
Right? And it's the same thing that happens in a coaching setting, but your job is to ask that question, like, what do you want to get out of this? And if they say, I really, really want to not have back pain, that's like, cool. If that's what you want, these are the recommendations that I have. They're much more likely to accept them if they've actually committed to this concept of trying to get rid of that back pain, and then they're willing to go through whatever difficulties associated with that to get to that other side, which is, pain-free, motion through their back or something like that. The same thing happens with coaching. It's like, I really want to get to this level of performance. I want to make, basketball team. I want to, go to the Olympics, whatever it is. You say, okay, how hard do you think you have to work to do that? What kind of things do you think that you need to be able to navigate to be able to do that? What, social settings do you need to maybe avoid to stay in a state that allows you to do that? They will answer those questions for you, rather than you saying, you need to avoid this, you need to do this, you need to do that. Because at the end of the day, like, it sounds silly, but you can never really make anyone do anything.
Yeah, and look, the reality is if you create too many constraints too quickly, you're going to get a lot of resistance, because people's willingness to change is typically a slow process as well. A question I wanted to ask you, because I just thought of it now, is I think about conferences, like say sports medicine, high performance conferences that we go to on a regular basis. Are there similar conferences for coaching?
Yeah.
At those conferences, who speaks? Is it mainly coaches or researchers?
Coaches.
Because this is something that I'm interested to talk.
There are some that researchers speak, but like, coaching is the ultimate bullshit detector. It's the greatest thing ever. Right, it's like we've spoken about it before, I think, right? Franz Bosch. People are fans of him. Some of his stuff is great. Some of it's not. The story behind Franz Bosch, I think, is really interesting because Franz tried to be a track coach and it didn't work for him. He actually failed dismally. And rather than sticking at it and getting to the point where he started to get good results, he shifted into a sport where he wouldn't be evaluated, rugby. And now he works exclusively consulting to teams where if he has a positive result, it's easy for him to be attributed with it. And if there's a negative result, he can just say, oh, it's their skills. They don't know how to play, right? And friends probably sue me. I don't know. But like, we don't probably have enough listeners. And we'd be very happy to have him on if he wants to correct me. Because I'm probably butchering some of the reality there. But the thing that always I do, which is probably not always the nicest thing, if someone says, oh yeah, I'm involved in high performance sport, right? I go and look at what they've done. So if they're like, oh, I once treated a person, you haven't been involved in high performance sport.
Yeah.
But if you were the team, you know, masseuse or physio or doctor or whatever for an NBA team, well, then you know what you're talking about and you've been involved in that environment. You know what goes on. And the same thing happens with coaches. So I think coaches particularly, we're very harsh towards each other. There's more support developing, which is good, but there's often a lot of criticism. And I don't think there should be as much criticism, but I think it's, as I said, it's the ultimate bullshit detector, because what happens is people say, well, you know, you've got this person, everyone knows that they've got an ability and you're not getting the results with them. You know, and it's the same with the team. Like you see it all the time in professional sports. You know, they in the EPL, they inherit a team and everyone goes, talented team, they should win the premiership. 3 weeks in, they've lost 3 games, gone. And you're like, why is it so difficult? And the reason is because, one, obviously there's a lot of money involved, so that's a big one, particularly in those sports. But I think that there is ultimate responsibility placed on these positions. And I think most coaches, if you're in the game long enough, you actually accept that that's the responsibility that you have to take on is the performance of those that you're influencing. Yeah.
Well, the reason why I asked the question about the conferences, because you've highlighted a point that I think is often missing in health professions, where you talk about coaching, talk about a lot of criticism happening. That's actually a positive thing though too, because it actually allows people's opinions and thoughts to be challenged. I think in health profession or in a lot of high performance, when you go to conferences, it's often just researchers presenting their work. You don't actually see a lot of clinicians giving their perspective or opinions based on their experiences. Do you think that's a problem?
It's a massive problem. It's probably one of the biggest issues that we currently face. I think the good thing is there does seem to be a lot more clinicians who are being involved in research, not necessarily at the university end. They're kind of being called in to be part of research as it happens. But it's a major problem. Right? And we've spoken about this so many times, you know, with the evidence-based practice model, people not understanding that only a third of it comes from the literature.
Yes, and not to mention, what does it even mean to actually integrate research into practice, which is a whole conversation in and of itself.
So it is a big problem, right? And the thing that's interesting about coaching, which I think is the same kind of conversation that we had when we spoke to Paul Coburn, is we shouldn't care what someone does, we should care about the results they get.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? As long as they're obviously not doing dangerous things. But as he said, like he works in compensable situation where they sometimes can't work out why that clinician seems to get people back to work sooner than everyone else. And they're like, why are they getting such good results? And people will look at what they do and they'll criticize, oh, they don't do this and they're not using the evidence and they're not doing this. And it's like, well, that doesn't matter. They're actually getting fantastic outcomes and everything they're doing is, you know, whether it has really strong research evidence, it's not dangerous. It's within the guidelines of, you know, accepted practice. So why are you criticizing that? And I think the same thing happens, it happens a lot with coaching in the sense that people will be like, oh, well, this group doesn't even do this. And it's like, it doesn't matter. Their athletes are doing well or their team's winning. So why are you concerned with what they are or not doing? And the thing that I think is different about the healthcare setting and research is the fact that there is in my mind at times, and it happens in coaching, but to a lesser extent, because the barriers to entry are lower. There's an over-intellectualization of healthcare, right? And there's a few reasons for that. Some of them is because there is a social, particularly for medical, there is a social currency for being a doctor. and the different types of medical practice even have higher levels of social hierarchy.
And you see that in other health professions. I mean, think of a physio working at an AFL club here in Melbourne. They're obviously held in very high regard.
Right. And that in itself creates this issue where people get this perception that they're smarter than they are. Right. And it's not to say that they're not intelligent people. They are. Right. They're very intelligent people. But it's in a particular domain. And
well, the other thing too is their intelligence isn't just about their clinical skills, but actually how they develop relationships and build rapport, because the reality is it's a very competitive environment. And a lot of it is not just about what you know, but who you know. And that's actually an important trait to remember.
But I also think that inflates people's, as I said, intellectual ego. And there is this issue where, particularly if you work in a bigger organization rather than as a personal coach, or a coach working who's ultimately responsible, say like a team, it's like you're the basketball coach.
Yep.
You are never actually held to that much account, in the sense that if you work in an AFL club and there's 3 doctors, or maybe not 3 doctors, but say there's 8 people in the medical team, if there's a result that happens that's not positive, no one person takes all the responsibility for that. Whereas it's funny, the head coach of that team, if the team loses, even though that head coach is not necessarily responsible for all the things that go on, they've got line coaches that set up, the way that they're going to play and tactics and blah, blah, blah. Who gets the bullet? The head coach.
Yeah.
And I think that's just the difference in the environment. So I think if we had that kind of environment where more responsibility was having to be, it's like, that skin in the game kind of idea was put forward to health practitioners, I think they would become more like coaches, and it would be more about getting the results than necessarily what you did, and no one would care how many papers you could recite. They just couldn't care less.
And I think a part of the issue too, with the bigger the organisation that you work in, typically, and this depends on culture, the less autonomy or flexibility you have with what's done and what you do, where it's very much these are kind of the protocols and expectations for how we do things.
Well, I think that's one of the cool things about being a coach, particularly at a local level or, or as a private coach, is you have the opportunity to experiment a lot.
Yeah.
And I think like health practitioners, I think in the same way, are very curious about things. But we're probably a lot, because obviously if it's a medical issue and there are health concerns associated with that, you have to be more conservative, because you're not going to do things that are going to put someone's health in jeopardy. Yeah,
and actually the other thing it makes me think of is, what is the work environment and the culture of your work environment? Like I think, for instance, we've taught courses, professional development courses before to physios, S&C coaches, and often they'll come into our environment. They often will give positive feedback of the equipment that we have, the resources that we use, the framework that we apply, and we try to teach them those skills. But then they go back to their own environment and realise
they don't have that.
They don't have that. They don't actually have the ability to do that because they're time limited, they don't have the resources, or quite frankly, they get a lot of resistance from their peers. And so part of the issue then too is are you able to create that philosophy of being able to experiment and continually question yourself and what you do, because it's actually encouraged to allow improvement to happen?
Yeah, I think that's a really big part, I think, of the development of a younger healthcare professional, is to actually be willing to kind of take some of those professional risks in a very controlled manner.
Absolutely.
But you need to learn, like, okay, what can I do with this? And we've spoken about this obviously a little bit with some of the surgeons that we've spoken to, where surgeons, particularly not maybe now, but in the past, had a lot more license to try things because there weren't techniques for stuff. So they would actually, John O'Donnell spoke about, like, he and one of his colleagues would make instruments because I can't actually access this thing, and I want to be able to do it so I can do, approach from this side. And not that that's hugely risk taking. They're just trying to improve the efficiency of what they do and get better outcomes. But like you're saying, they were making stuff. Now they wouldn't be allowed to do that because of, like safety protocols to do with infection control, right? They just go, well, you made that in your bloody shed. Just because you sterilized it doesn't mean that you can use that. It has to be certain grade steel, and it has to be this, and it has to be that. And
you then do RCT to show that it's effective, and
there's good reason for why we do those things, because someone's health ultimately is at risk. If you put something in a foreign, instrument into something that you're doing, and then they get an infection and have a major health issue.
Of course.
It's not the same as going, we're going to try this training today. That didn't work. I strained my calf.
Yeah, you're not, a surgeon's not bringing a tool in from their shed at home and going, what, we're going to use this.
And that's fair.
Yeah.
But that kind of culture of experimentation and exploring things, I think, is really important in healthcare. But often, as you said, it's not necessarily always encouraged. And as we have to keep reiterating, there's professional boundaries to that. It's like, you're not going to go something that's outside of your scope of practice.
Yeah, of course.
But as you said, with what we do here, not that the equipment that we have doesn't necessarily change the fact that the reason that we have some of this stuff often is because we're trying to explore solving problems that we weren't able to actually solve. We collect things because we're like, how do we load this in a way that's going to lead to better tendon, rehab? How do we, improve this feature that we didn't have the ability to be able to, manage? That's what drives a lot of that, is a curiosity.
Yeah, and do you create the space to allow yourself to think again and rethink? Because again, I think of one of our physios here, and you hear the story of time and again of people who work in amateur sport, and they're at the club for an hour and a half, and they've got to see 20 players within an hour, or an hour and a half, and you go, okay, it's pretty difficult to really think through what you're doing and actually apply clinical reasoning and think, why did this work? Why didn't this work? When you're thinking, okay, I've got 5 minutes to quickly assess your ankle and try and figure out what's going on.
That's actually a really good point. I think that's one of the major reasons why we see the differences between the two kind of professions, is that there's a lot of the intellectual side of coaching is a lot of thinking about how to solve problems. And the challenges that come with that, whether it's at a team level or at an individual level. I don't think we're necessarily afforded that same level of thinking time, or it's not encouraged in healthcare. We're not necessarily given, and again, this is something we spoke about when we spoke to Helen and Colin, the barristers that we had on, of like, they get given a problem and they might have 2 weeks to prepare their answer to that problem.
Yeah.
There isn't the environment for you to be able to do that in a healthcare setting. And as a coach, because it's an ongoing relationship, you do have that kind of opportunity to think about that. And it's not that that doesn't happen in healthcare. Like for us, I think we're lucky in the sense that, we often will be managing, say, if it's a rehab thing, say if it's ACL, it might be 12 months. So you're constantly given the opportunity to like think and rethink and say, that didn't really work for this person. I'm not getting the changes that I want that's going to allow them to return to their sport or whatever. Yeah. So I'm going to try this. That does happen, but it's not as common as what it should be.
Yeah. Maybe the think of someone like Peter O'Sullivan, who's a researcher over in WA and a physio.
Looks at a lot of back pain, yeah.
A lot of back pain. And it's interesting because he does a lot of presentations, he does a lot of studies, but a lot of people criticize his studies because it's n equals 1 or n equals 5. But I actually have a lot of respect for the fact that he's actually always tinkering. He's always throwing out lots of ideas, and he changes his framework for how he does things or keeps evolving it a lot. And there's actually, I have a lot of respect for that. Now, if you want to be critical about the research he does or how many people he has in it.
That's okay.
And as you should. But I remember also too, I can't remember if Richard Newsham-West brought this up when he came in, but I remember him saying that, say 15, 20 years ago, he used to do a lot of presenting at conferences where he would be doing case studies. And actually that he did a presentation of, maybe it was only 10 years ago, of looking at how many case studies used to be presented at conferences versus now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And has it gone down, obviously?
Well, as you can imagine, it's gone down massively, and now it's much more big, large clinical trials. But that also changes the kind of information that gets put out there, and it also changes how people think. Because if you're someone who's like, here, I've got a case study, it's n equals 1 of a calf strain, and this is what we did and this is why we did it, people are going to be like, that's interesting, that's kind of different to the conventional wisdom of how we look at a calf strain. But at the same time too, it plants the seed of going, we can think outside the box here. if you've got this large clinical trial of we had 100 people and this is what we did and this is the outcome and this is the protocol we use, it very much reinforces that method of, okay, we need to be very protocol driven with everything that we do. So I think we need to be mindful of how, from that very much a top-down approach, how we influence clinicians' thinking, because that has implications for what they do in the real world.
I think, like, you know, the more practical part of my brain starts to think, like, one of the issues with this is obviously the changes to legislation and insurance, and how that's probably starting to put more and more pressure on healthcare practitioners to not necessarily do things that go outside the so-called evidence base.
There's always that standard of what's best practice. You know, the reality is, depending on the environment, depending on your profession, there's an opportunity to deviate away from that to an extent. But yeah, the reality is it seems to be becoming tighter and tighter of how much you can bend that.
You know, we've spoken about this. Yeah, we have spoken about this before, I know. So apologies if you've heard this conversation. But I think one of the things that leads to a lot of healthcare practitioners not doing and going outside that scope is because they're actually cautious of someone not getting a good outcome and then having to justify why they went away from that clinical practice guidelines or the best clinical practice guidelines in any way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like, if this exists here, why aren't you doing that? And the answer is very simple. It's like, I have someone in front of me who's an individual who needs much more specific input.
Yes.
Not they need me to use the average. However, you will be much more protected if you apply the average and get a bad result, because you can stand behind that, than if you get a bad result and you haven't stuck to it. Then you can be heavily criticized for that. And when I say you haven't stuck to it, I don't mean you're doing things outside of your scope of practice, but you're maybe not following the guidelines to a T. You're using your clinical judgment to actually change things slightly.
And again, this comes back to how you actually set up those safe to fail experiments, because you don't want to be setting up experiments where it's like, well, that failed miserably and the patient...
Well, I'll give you an example, right? So I think one of the things that's become, and I know that we've in some ways criticized this a little bit, but like, there are some people who would argue that the best clinical guidelines for managing a tendinopathy is to do 4 weeks of isometric loading. Right, to start with, then transition to through range, then start to do more elastic or high velocity tasks, or more, 4 weeks, maybe longer, whatever. Get them to pain-free level. Often, I won't use isometrics at all, right? However, it's interesting in my dealings with some of the sports doctors that I actually really trust, and you know, hopefully they trust me. But like they, you know, the interactions I have with them, with some of the athletes that have tendinopathy, when you say to them, "Oh, we didn't do isometrics," they're like, "Oh, well, you should have done them." And you sort of think, well, why are you criticizing me for that? Like, is that because you think that that's the only way to treat this? Or because you've locked into this conservatism of following what's put as the guidelines? And the reason that I won't use them is because, for instance, when we've tested some of those things, those people test very well.
Well, I was going to say, because I'm sure there are times where you do use them.
Well, like as an example, you know, and we promoted it for a while, like the Axis system through strings by numbers. It allows us to do isometric testing. So say if someone has an Achilles tendinopathy and we do isometric testing and they score off the charts, right? You know, way beyond what's considered a normal value for the population that they're in. Why would you then go and implement isometrics for a painful tendon when clearly that's not the tissue characteristic that is missing? Even though it says they've got mid-portion Achilles tendinopathy, you should start with isometrics. And I'm not saying anyone's forcefully making you do that, but there would be people who would argue that that's the best clinical practice guidelines to use, right? Based on the research that has been presented, particularly in Australia, right? So I think that's part of it is, you know, we as health practitioners, we're often scared of being criticized by our peers and also potentially being looked at to have been going outside of the clinical guidelines in case we ever get questioned on it at any level.
Look, again, part of that is just the simple thing of, well, what do you see as the main modulators to their presentation, and what's their trajectory as you apply those interventions, and do you see the change that you want? I think the other thing too is if you want to have people come back and see you, you need to make sure that you're getting the best outcome for them. And that often will mean that what you think may be the best thing for them isn't the actual case. But yeah, part of that is also then thinking of, well, why didn't I get that outcome that I expected to? Because there's always reason for it. It's not that it's trivial or completely non-correlated.
Yeah, we probably won't talk about that now, but I actually think that at some point we should do a conversation on things like, say, non-specific low back pain and how that actual term is not helpful. I know that you've presented some research on how that term's probably changing and people are starting to look at that very differently.
Yeah. Well, look, and I think that's when we can argue of like, here's the best practice for treating, say, a stress fracture, and thinking, well, how much should you deviate away from that? But then the big question comes is, well, how do you treat something like non-specific pain? Because is there a protocol? Is there a best practice for that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the same principles do apply for a lot of injuries. You know, think of a soft tissue strain as a good example of that, of the multitude of factors and modulators associated with why someone gets a soft tissue strain in a non-traumatic incident. Like what I mean by that, like someone doesn't push their leg or into a position that causes excessive strain through the tissue. Again, we need to be cognizant of how do we think about solving such a problem? Because I think that's also something that we need to consider of what does actual science and research apply? What does it actually do? Does it give us answers? Or does it give us information and signals for what may be appropriate given the context of that study? And well, I have the opinion that's very much the latter. You don't ever look at anything as being definitive, conclusive, end of conversation.
Verbatim, yeah.
Totally. I mean, that might apply in much more kind of ordered systems where you might look at, I don't know.
A plus B equals C, yeah.
Exactly. But the reality is the same principles most often don't apply in human systems. Did you want to touch on anything else in this topic, John?
No, it's just if you are someone who's interested in coaching or even any sort of level of kind of teaching or imparting sort of knowledge onto people, I think as a health practitioner it's worth doing. I think it'll teach you a hell of a lot. So as much as I probably sometimes complain even on the podcast about the difficulties of being involved in coaching, I think it's a worthwhile experience.
Yeah, and look, I mean, it's the reason why we actually do this in the first place is because we like to have these conversations and challenge ourselves. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's plenty of things that we say that people will be like, well, that's not correct, or I disagree with you. And it's like, good, that's
share that with us.
Totally, absolutely. That's one of the reasons we want to do is actually start conversations to be able to help people think differently and hopefully lead to better outcomes for clinicians or coaches.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for joining us.